So we've talked about the causes and the beginning of the French Revolution and a bit about the American Revolution and how it influenced the French Revolution. Now we're going to move on to kind of the what's happening during the French Revolution and how it ends and the rise of Napoleon. So first, who was Napoleon? Right? He's an unusual kind of person to come to power in France. He's pretty much Italian. His parents are Italian. He's Italian nobility. He doesn't even speak French till he's 10 years old. Right? He's born on this island that only becomes part of France the year he was born. Now, eventually, his father does, come to live in France, and he goes with him. And he starts to learn French, but he always kind of speaks with an accent. But he becomes fluent. He goes to the French military academy, the École Militaire in Paris, and becomes an artillery officer. So he's joining the military right around the time of the French Revolution, right? So he's rising through the ranks fairly quickly as the French Revolutionary Army has decided to kind of preemptively go out and fight their neighbors. One, they think at least that they've kicked out their king, who was allies with a bunch of these other countries. So they're like, well, we're surely about to be attacked by all these other monarchies in Europe, and we should go ahead and go spread our revolutionary ideas, right? So they go ahead and go start fighting other countries in Europe, and Napoleon does very well. By the age of 24, extremely young, even for this time, he becomes a general in the French army. So let's go back to France for a bit. So France, they have this revolution, right? They kick out the king, and they start going through different phases of governments. We're not going to go over every single one or in detail, but know that they're going through several different phases, and different groups control it at different times. Now, in France, they have this assembly, this representative government. On the left side sits those like the Jacobins, the radical left, right? So those on the left, the liberals sit on the left, the more conservatives sit on the right. Those would be monarchists at this time. And then those in the middle sit in the middle. And this is where we get the idea of the left and the right political spectrum. So even today, if you're in America, if you are said to be left-wing, that means you're more liberal. If you're right-wing, that means you're more conservative, right? So that came out of the French Revolution, and we still use it today. Now, as the leftists, like the Jacobins, become more powerful and gain more control, they get a little more radical. The revolution becomes more radical. And when Louis had been able to stay alive before, now he's thought of as a symbol of the old regime, and they want to get rid of him. They want to chop his head off, right? And which eventually happens, him and his wife. And that's turning to a more violent part of the French Revolution until we get to the most violent part, known as the Reign of Terror. This guy, Maximilien Robespierre, is kind of seen as the face of the Reign of Terror, right? He's more or less in charge of France during the time. He's the chair of this Committee of Public Safety, which becomes kind of the de facto government of France. And basically, if he doesn't like you, he'll chop your head off. And this is when they go through and they start finding anybody he thinks is an enemy of the state. Right? One of the members of the Committee of Public Safety said, "Let's make terror the order of the day." So as many people as they can find that they think threaten the revolution. It could be former nobility or former clergy of the first and second estate. So a lot of those people are leaving or have already left France, and those that haven't, they could be subject to death. And the main form of execution is the guillotine. So nearly some 17,000 deaths. Those are just official deaths, where they had at least some kind of trial. and then they sentenced him to death, usually by the guillotine, and then some 300,000 people put in jail, 10,000 of those dying just sitting in jail because there was just too many people being killed, right? And there's that's 17,000 about a year. That's something like 50 executions a day. Oh, and real quick, think about how the guillotine could be a product of the Enlightenment. So it seems barbaric to us, but at the time it was thought of as kind of like a humane way to kill somebody, right? It's relatively quick and possibly relatively painless. It's hard to say, since if you have it used on you, you don't really get to say anything anymore. But yeah, relatively quick and painless. It works the same way every single time, no matter who you are, a prince or a pauper, right? The rich and the poor, it works exactly the same every way. And it's thought of as being relatively humane. And it's just a new invention, a new product of science and reason. So there's this reign of terror going on, and eventually people cannot stand the terror, the fear of living under the watch of the Committee of Public Safety. Again, what an ironic name. So eventually there's this reaction called the Thermidorian reaction, where this group, the Thermidorians, kind of take over. They have an uprising. They capture Robespierre, kick him out, and establish another government, a more moderate government called the Directory. And Napoleon was an associate of Robespierre, meaning he knew him. So he's kind of under suspicion briefly, but they decide that he didn't know him, he wasn't part of it, so they let Napoleon go. And guess what happens to Robespierre? That's right, he loses his head. So after all that beheading, he's one of the last ones beheaded, during the Reign of Terror, at least. Speaking of last, the actual last person to be executed by the guillotine was in 1970s in France. That was much later than you might think. The last public execution was in the 1940s. So there were people alive who could have easily seen the guillotine in action. So the Directory was never super effective, right? You could say it was kind of set up to fail from the beginning. It never had a lot of support, and there's all kinds of problems. Still plenty of problems going on in France. France has wars. And now it's having like a civil war, fighting against itself. Corrupt leaders. Economy is still not doing well. But Napoleon is doing quite well, right? He's over in Europe, parts of Europe, overseas in Egypt and Syria. Not always successful militarily, but he himself is outstanding and does have several successes. So he returns to Paris in 1799 as a hero, right? People greet him in the streets. There's basically a parade for him. He's like a conquering hero come and returns. And many people kind of see himself as a savior, like maybe he will help us out of these problems we're having. But there's a problem. The Directory has an age limit. You have to be, I think it's something like 35 years old to serve on the Directory. And Napoleon is only 20. He's too young, right? He's below the age limit. So he begins plotting the overthrow of the Directory, and he stages what we now call a coup d'état, right? And you'll still hear this word used in the English language. If you stage a coup, it's an overthrow. So Napoleon, he invents this conspiracy, right? The Jacobins, those radical left-leaning groups, he's like, they are trying to take over our government, right? They are a threat to our government. And so I am going to go ahead and take control instead so they don't take control. And then he was much more popular than the Jacobins, so he is able to successfully do this. Right? He establishes what you call the French consulate. Napoleon and two other men technically have control, but really, in effect, Napoleon is the only one with any real control. And he has one more election. Basically, he's elected consul for life in 1802. By 1804, he has decided he wants to be emperor, and the Senate declares him emperor of France, and he's crowned by the Pope, and the first French Empire is established. Now, I'd like to look at these two images real quick, these two paintings. They tell a story, almost for 400 years apart. Let's look at them for a minute. Now, notice in this one, back in the 1400s, pretty much the medieval period, notice who has the authority here in this image, right? You see the Pope, the guy on the left with the big hat. He is crowning the King, Charles, who is knelt before him. You could say in this image, the Pope, and therefore God, has the authority, and he is giving authority to the King. Here, it's hard to even tell where the Pope is. Therefore, you can already assume that the Pope has less authority in this image, right? And the one standing above everybody else is Napoleon, right? Who is about to crown his wife. And the story goes that Napoleon invites the Pope to crown him as new emperor. And when the Pope goes to crown Napoleon, Napoleon takes the crown from the Pope's hands and puts it on his own head. And then he crowns his wife. So you could say this is a symbol, right? Symbolic of what the change that's happened in Europe. You go from the church being the authority, God providing the authority, to the king. And here we have a more enlightened ruler who he still wants the authority of the church there, because there's still a lot of Catholic people in France. But also, he is saying, look, I have made myself emperor, I've done it with my own powers, and I'm putting the crown on my own head, using his own logic, reason, and abilities. So what is liberalism? Think back to John Locke. Remember what he thought about people being generally good, government being small, and protecting your natural rights. So it's all about protecting freedoms and human rights and representative democracy, and that's a big part of liberalism also. So how did Napoleon spread liberalism? Well, he put a lot of these liberal ideas in his Napoleonic Code, right? Which, as he went and conquered parts of Europe, he helped spread those ideas by implementing this code throughout Europe. What about nationalism? So there's several different definitions of nationalism, but one really important one we're going to look at right now, the idea that people view themselves as a unified nation or country, right? So before Napoleon, before the French Revolution, most people wouldn't really think of themselves as a citizen of a country. They didn't really think of themselves, like in France, almost nobody would have called themselves French before the French Revolution, right? If they were from Paris, they might think of themselves as a Parisian, right? Just a man from Paris, a person from Paris. No real thought of themselves as being part of this unified group of people called the French. But as the revolution occurs, they start to think of themselves as having things in common, like we're all French. We all believe in democracy and liberal ideas, and therefore we are all unified in one French people. And as Napoleon goes and conquers different areas, he kind of helps promote these ideas. Like in Italy, he like groups all the people that speak Italian in one big area. He's like, you're all just Italians, right? All the Germans, you're all Germans. Spanish, you're all Spanish. Um, when before, places like Italy and Germany, there had been a dozen different little countries and states there, not unified together. But after Napoleon, they start to kind of think of themselves as being one big group. And that's how he helps spread nationalism. Here we see Napoleon's empire stretches from Spain up to Prussia, almost to into Russia, down to Austria and Italy, and then overseas he has territories in the Middle East and North Africa and the Americas and other places. So very large, powerful empire. So what impact did he leave on Europe and the world as a whole? So we mentioned liberalism, helping spread those liberal ideas through the Napoleonic Code. Nationalism, people viewing themselves as a unified nation or people. He's helping spread those ideas as he goes also. And then here we have one way he greatly impacted the United States of America. Right? This is what you call the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Territory here was sold by Napoleon to the United States of America. Right? He needed money to fund his wars, and America needed territory, so they purchased the Louisiana Territory and almost doubled the size of the United States. For just $300 million in what would be today's money, $300 million, just $15 million at the time. In fact, the American government wanted to buy wanted to buy New Orleans, but instead Napoleon said, "Well, I'll give you the whole thing for just $15 million." So they just bought the whole territory, doubled the size of the United States.